So like she said, so I am Alice Castle. I am a counselor specialist with Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation Services, or IVRS. I just went into this role. I came off of maternity leave and interviewed for it on my very last day of maternity leave in January. So I am really new to being this counselor specialist, but prior to that, I was a VR counselor for 6 years in the Des Moines office, and then 1 year, my very first year, was in the Ottumwa area office. I got my bachelor's at Loras College in Dubuque in psychology and Spanish, and then came here to Drake, and I got my master's in rehabilitation counseling, which is how I got here. Fun fact about me, I chopped off about 9 inches of my hair right before coming here, so my head feels a little lighter today than it normally does. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a little weird. It is, I know. I'm like, when I go to wash it, it's going to be kind of wonky. But yeah, so I hope you guys, please slow me down. I will say I get extremely nervous, even if presenting in front of a few people. And this is my first time ever presenting at a conference by myself. So if I start to go too fast or anything, please let me know. And it can be nice and casual in here. I know it's just a small group. So I know in this we're going to kind of talk about like the legislation that kind of drives pre-employment transition services and how you can kind of access them, or how any student or child of yours can access pre-employment transition services. So that's kind of what we're going to go over today. So it all kind of started with the WIOA legislation, or Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, that was signed into law in July of 2014. And this was huge. This really encouraged a lot of our core partners here to work together. The whole idea behind this legislation is to help those who have barriers to employment gain access to higher education or higher quality jobs. Come on in. I read that book. It was a really good book. Radium Girls. Your shirt. Yeah. Oh. Didn't even know it was a play, but it was a very interesting book, I will say. Radium Girls, if you guys haven't read it. So this really opened up how IVRS works with schools specifically, and this changed kind of how students can access our services. So initially, students had to be found eligible. They had to apply for Voc Rehab, they had to be found eligible, and then they could start working with a counselor on intensive services. However, with the introduction of WIOA, that kind of started granting access to our services for any student that was on an IEP, a 504, or they were covered under the provisions of 504. So they had a disability, but maybe they weren't on a 504 or an IEP. So this kind of gave us a lot of new language. So bear with me if I start using acronyms. Obviously with the state and schools, we all use those. So we developed potentially eligible students. We have those who are IVRS eligible, and then it introduced these services, these Pre-ETS, or pre-employment transition services. Okay, so you have your potentially eligible students. So these are students, like I said, they're on an IEP, they're on a 504, or they might have another disability that creates a barrier to employment. So these students who are potentially eligible can now access services through Voc Rehab, but they have to sign what we call a Pre-ETS agreement. So this allows us to kind of get them into our system, to help us understand what services they are needing. And this allows us to serve them on some level without actually having to open a case file. Now these students, if they end up not opening a case file, they just remain potentially eligible with us. Those services do end once they leave high school. We do have some students who continue on into post-secondary training who are still eligible. You just have to be under the age of 21 to still receive these services. Now, a student who is IVRS eligible has gone through our application process. They've applied for our services. We have found them eligible, and then they started working with us under what we call an IPE, a little different than an IEP. So this is our individualized plan for employment that a student then develops once they start working with an IVRS counselor. Now, bear with me here. I'm going to jump over really quick, and I apologize. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had multiple things up, so bear with me while I find the one that we had the email. Is it all right if I open the email again?
Yes. Yep.
Maybe. Or I might skip it. I don't know what's going on. Sorry. Okay, we'll forget about it. I had a cool little info to graphic to show you, but it's okay. Kind of comparing the routes. So a student can be connected as a potentially eligible student many different ways. So they might have a teacher send them over, or a parent might have a pre-ETS agreement signed, and that gets to the counselor. And like I said, those students can start working with the counselor once that pre-ETS agreement has been signed. And on that form, you'll kind of list out what services you're really wanting your student to access. And again, the counselor will work with them. It won't be quite as intensive probably as a student that has an open case file. That's where you're really going to start to see a lot of those intensive one-on-one services. You might have a student that attends like a high school, and in that high school, a lot of the voc rehab counselors will provide pre-ETS services in group form. So you might have your student attending a lot of these pre-ETS classes while they're in high school. Oftentimes I'll find that many parents don't know that their students actually participating in these activities. So I always kind of encourage some good communication between the parent and the IEP team and the voc rehab counselor. In case those classes are going on, you want to know what your student's been accessing. So it's always a really good thing to bring up if you're at an IEP meeting to see, has my student been in these, or does your school offer those and partner with voc rehab to offer these throughout the school year? Yeah, absolutely. Please chime in.
So what I'm understanding is that IVRS can go into the school system during the school day to provide pre-ETS training there.
Yes. Yes. So we have a counselor ideally assigned to every single school in the district, or in the state, not the district. So for example, when I was a counselor in the Des Moines Metro, I covered like Valley High School, Dowling, Urbandale, and then I would go in and offer pre-ETS kind of classes. So I'll get into this a little bit later, but oftentimes we will meet, ideally your counselor will meet with their local school team and kind of talk about what gaps do we have in our services and where can VR kind of help fill that. Teachers, if you have a student on an IEP, you know, they have that B page, the living, learning, working, and they have a big focus on transition, self-advocacy, things that we have on here that I'll talk about. And the school might say, hey, you know, we need a little help in finding ways to teach self-advocacy skills. So maybe I might come in and do a class on self-advocacy as a VR counselor. It really depends on what that counselor has decided with that school district. So it looks very different for every single school and for every counselor. Again, it really depends on what the school is wanting. It might be one big thing throughout the year, or like for example, I went in on the first Friday of every month and delivered like a class to every period throughout the day. But it looks different just depending on what the school is wanting. Yeah. So these are the 5 pre-employment transition services, or pre-ETS, that we have. So job exploration counseling is really kind of talking about, you know, what are the needs in a certain job area, or what careers are out there, maybe doing some interest inventories, things like that. Work-based learning experiences. This is a really big one, and I know a lot of schools are trying to expand their work-based learning opportunities for students. So we really want to get students out there. It's one thing to like hear about a job, like oftentimes we'll have a student say, I want to be a nurse, or I want to be a dentist, but it's because it's something they know. But there are a lot of different jobs out there in the healthcare system. So oftentimes you might try to set up like a job site tour or a job shadow, things for the students to get in there and really see what the jobs look like, or what the work environment might look like for them. Counseling opportunities is really talking about post-secondary training. So what are your opportunities for training, maybe going over the FAFSA, all of that fun stuff. Workplace readiness training, making sure they have the social skills and making sure they have a resume, getting them all ready for that and work environment. And then self-advocacy instruction. And this is kind of twofold. So if we have those students that are going on to post-secondary, it looks very different. The supports you're getting in high school school compared to college. So we really want our students to be prepared to know, what are the accommodations I'm receiving on my IEP? Are those still accommodations that I could get when I'm in college, or what does that look like, and how do I advocate for myself in a post-secondary setting? But we also want our students to know how to advocate for their needs, talk about their barriers, any accommodations they might need in an employment setting as well. So these are the big areas that we're focusing on when we're working with students. Now I will say it gets a little confusing, again, when you're using PE and eligible and you're talking pre-ETS, it can get really jumbled up. So when I'm talking about potentially eligible students and eligible, pre-ETS are the services that can be provided to any of them. So pre-ETS are the services, potentially eligible and eligible are kind of like your eligibility level within our system. So I mentioned this before, so we have what's called a Pre-ETS agreement, and this is a form that has to be signed and given to your voc rehab counselor, so it is signed off by the guardian, the student, and the VR counselor to get our student into the system so we can track them, put notes about our services, and hopefully eventually open a file if that's what's needed later on after we determine that. So this is a form that you should be able to get from your IVRS counselor. Most AEA personnel have access to this too. As we introduce the new IEP system through our schools, your teachers will have access to this Pre-ETS agreement too. So a parent can sign this. I always recommend having a conversation with the VR counselor or with your teacher to determine, is this appropriate? How would my student access services if we did sign this agreement? But this is big to stress that the Pre-ETS agreement is not the application for our services. So it's something that might get our students going with us, but that's not the formal application. That would come later if you wanted to actually open a case file. Now, if you wanted to actually apply for our services, you would complete an application with us. I'm not going to open everything up because I'm always afraid it's just not going to work. But the application would be done. Again, I've had referrals and applications come from many different people. It might come from a teacher, AEA, case manager if you have one, if you're on the waiver, or you as a parent can apply for our services. You would then meet with the IVRS counselor that would be assigned to that school, and then you would do an intake. Typically, those take about an hour. At this intake, you're doing a lot of the demographic, fun information, that kind of stuff. But then you're also going to talk about your students' barriers to employment. How would Voc Rehab be able to best support your student as they go on through high school and transition out into adult services? Then you would go on and we would do an eligibility. So you do have to have a diagnosis that creates a barrier to employment. It looks different for everybody. Like some might have anxiety, but it doesn't impact their ability to work, but others might have anxiety and it keeps them from going to work or holding a job. So that's where you have that discussion and that intake of how does this really impact my student. We then have to get medical documentation to prove that diagnosis. I will tell you as a counselor, if you're a parent and you have any psychological evaluations or anything from doctors, if you could bring it to the intake, that speeds up the process a lot, but we can get those records. We can request those records on our end. We do have 3 levels of eligibility. So we have our others eligible. So those are students or applicants that we find to not have any significant barriers in our 7 major barriers that we look at. We have a middle level, so that's significantly disabled. So we find that you have a major barrier in one level that we have, and then most significantly disabled. So we're finding that you have significant barriers in many different levels, like self-direction, mobility, communication, interpersonal skills. And there is, at this time, no wait list for our students that fall on that level. And there is, as far as I know, not a wait list for the students on that middle level. But this is where we encourage, if you feel that this is a service that you really want, to apply and go through that intake process, because we just don't know when we may have to implement a waiting list in the future. It all depends on funding. So if this is something you want, I always encourage to approach your VR counselor and talk about doing that. After you're found eligible, If you're off the wait list, if we have one, we then get together and we write that individualized plan for employment. And this is where we really list out what are the services that you are going to need to be successful, to find employment and to maintain employment as you go on. This kind of draws out our plan, especially if we have students. We understand that they'll probably work with us for years. So this is just a start. Your very first one, we talk about what that might look like, what your employment goals may be, and how do we get there. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Is a student eligible for services if they are working?
That's a really good question, actually. Yes, so you can still be eligible for our services if you're working. I've had a number of students apply for our services, and they might be able to get a job. Let's just say Pizza Ranch, I don't know. But if your student might have trouble maybe accessing higher paying jobs or higher quality jobs, or might need assistance in post-secondary training, things like that, those are still reasons to apply. And like I said, as long as they have a diagnosis that you can see creating a barrier to employment, definitely still apply. And the goal is to get our students working. So it's a great thing if they're working, and that doesn't exclude you from our services. But that was a good question. And I will tell you, for this IPE, if you have a student with an IEP, it is not nearly as intensive a process. I know that can be quite a bit, but one thing we do is we do an annual review of that employment plan, just like you would an IEP or a 504. Okay, so here, this kind of answer your question as to like, what does that look like? So at the beginning of every school year, ideally, we have the counselor meet with the local school team. That looks different in every school. Ideally, you're gonna have some teachers, AEA personnel. Depending on the size of the school, you'd have like the principal or the associate principal that oversees special ed. Sometimes you will also have the special ed director at this meeting. And here's kind of where we lay out on this employment plan all of those pre-ETS services, and we look at what does the school already offer in job exploration counseling. Do they have any classes that allow students to explore? They do like the Naviance or things like that, to look at what their interests are. And then we look at what can VR do to fill that gap. Are there things that they're offering, but they just might not be able to do, or they need a little help? And where can VR step in? What does that service look like when we come into the school? And some schools might have a contracted program. If you're familiar enough with the system, you might have heard that we have an intermediary network or a TAP program, or you might hear other schools kind of throw that out. We also then add them into that local school plan to see, here's a school, here's a VR counselor, and here's maybe where that contracted program might step in and provide services. And we go through all of those, work-based learning, talk about that, how can we maybe get students out there. I will say that sometimes Voc Rehab can step in. Schools might have a hard time connecting to businesses, and that's one of our specialties, is helping create business partnerships throughout the community. And this is where we can partner with teachers, especially those work experience coordinators or those senior plus teachers who really want to get their students out there in the community. Oftentimes we might step in and partner with them to help create those connections so they can get the students out there. Or we might set up job shadows or whatever whatever those students are needing. So this is where we really lay out how are we going to collaborate. Also kind of where we talk about, when can I come into your school? What does that look like? I know a lot of teachers right now are having a really hard time finding time to get students out. I know it's really hard for them to just hit the things that they have to in order to graduate. So finding time to pull students is really difficult. This is where we can kind of get together and plan out, is there a convenient time? Do you guys have seminar, or do you have advisory somewhere where I can come in and I'm not taking up a teacher's time? I know that's really hard, especially when students need to be pulled out for other things too. So this is where we collaborate and talk about how we can best work together and fill each other's gaps a little bit, especially in regards to pre-employment transition services. And ideally, we're coming out with positive outcomes for our students. They're getting a little more exposed to services, to employment, and ideally they're leaving high school with a better idea of what it is they might like to do. They have better skills to find employment, or they know how to move forward in post-secondary training and how to advocate for themselves in that arena as well.
You'll meet with every school in the state?
That's the plan, yes.
Seriously?
Yeah. So every high school should have a local school plan. Oftentimes, I think we might get together and write it and then forget to refer back to it throughout the year. But yes, that's something that you can ask about too if you ever have a question.
Done over the summer and during the school year, throughout the year?
It looks a little different. Typically it's done in the fall at the beginning of the school year. Ideally, we're coming back together in the spring to talk about what worked, what didn't work, how can we kind of reevaluate things. And usually schools know, oh, we might be changing to block periods next year, or this did not work at all. So as we're reevaluating, you guys are planning for the fall, let's maybe set up more job site tours instead of like classroom stuff. So it's a really good time to touch base again, see what worked well and didn't. But yes, in the fall, I think by November 1st is when the new school plan has to be entered in.
I just have a question about that. So, Voc Rehab is checking in with every school at least once a year,
Yeah.
hopefully more than that.
Yeah.
So schools obviously know about Voc Rehab services, but I know transition starts at age 14.
Yes.
In the state of Iowa. And so when should Voc Rehab be invited for the first time to an IEP team meeting?
That's a really good question. And I would say, especially as things are changing, as wait lists are getting a lot longer for waiver services, I would say the sooner the better. That way we can get in. And like I said, we never know if a wait list is going to be implemented back at Voc Rehab. So, and we can't serve a student if the wait list is there. Now, there's one caveat to that. So say I worked with your student as a potentially eligible student. We have pre-ETS going. I don't know why I keep saying it. We have pre-ETS in the works. We've then applied and they go on the wait list. I can continue to serve them through pre-ETS. But not everybody does that. Some might just go right into the application. So I would say if you know about VR, you want them present at that IEP meeting to at least start talking about it, yes, invite them at any time.
Do you have any idea of when that usually happens in real life with school districts? When do they actually invite you?
Yes, that's a good question. It depends, I would say, on how good of a relationship that school has with that Voc Rehab counselor. So if you have a VR counselor that's been in the school for years, or if they have a contracted program, like I said, like a TAP, who's very involved in that high school, you might see your counselor a little bit sooner. Just because the teachers are a little more comfortable talking about the services, they know the counselor, like, hey, let's bring Alice in to talk about, what she can offer your student. If they don't have like a really good relationship with VR for whatever reason, they might not think to do that. So realistically, I think a lot of teachers might have an idea that VR should be brought in around junior, senior year. But again, yes, ideally we might be getting in sooner, especially for those students that have intensive needs. Again, a lot is going to be on the school, even though you have a VR counselor, but it's still good to have that VR counselor involved so we know what's going on and can help for the future planning. Yeah.
That would be ideal time.
Yeah.
My son is 19 and they just brought in Voc Rehab.
Yeah. And that's really common, I hate to say. Yes.
Districts, I would like to educate myself so others don't have that same situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're seeing that happening, again, on our website, you can see all the area offices, their supervisors. If you have questions or concerns about that, you're always welcome to reach out to the counselor or the VR supervisor to say, hey, this is something we're seeing. Or again, I'm a counselor specialist in the area of transition. We just created these positions this year. So now we're kind of split, and it's our job to assist in creating relationships or helping the area offices do that in the area of transition. So,
Question for you. So
yeah.
at whatever point you get Voc Rehab involved, they will continue to stay involved until graduation. And so like say at 15,
Yeah.
10th grade. So 10th, 11th, 12th grade, Voc Rehab will continue to be in, or is it just a certain period of time?
Yes, so if your student is just potentially eligible, then yes, we can continue to serve that student until they graduate. Unless they're not going on to like a post-secondary institution, right? So assuming they just graduate high school and leave, they're done, then your services would end. Now, if your student applied for our services and they were eligible, they have an employment plan with us, there is no age limit or time limit for our services. And this is like the big perk of Voc Rehab is I think oftentimes we're so well supported in high school. We have the IEP, we have a really good team, and then we lose all of that as soon as we leave the high school. And VR is that nice transition there to help you transition out of high school into whatever it is you're doing, post-secondary education, adult services. It's confusing, and it's a big shift from high school IEP services to adult services. So we're kind of that nice bridge there to help kind of make that gap a little easier.
And you touched on this. So the only thing required is that IEP already in place. So it doesn't waiver status, none of that matters in order to do both your pre-ETS and your intake, right? Both of them, you could simply just have the IEP but no other services and still qualify for rehab.
Yes. Now I'm going to just pause on that really quick. So an IEP, yes, qualifies you to be potentially eligible. Where I hesitate to say just an IEP is fine enough to be eligible. In the past, we were able to utilize an IEP to do an eligibility, whereas we can't do that anymore. So you would need to have a formal diagnosis that we could utilize to create or to make you eligible for our services. Yeah, so, but an IEP or 504, yes, that's fine to just be potentially eligible.
But the waiver, it has nothing to do with waiver. Because I know in
Yes.
this discussion I overheard somebody say, well, if you're not on the waiver, you can't get voc rehab. And I was like, well, that doesn't. I'm just going to clarify.
Yeah, oh yeah,
I was very much like, well, that's not right.
Yes.
And I thought, well, I should probably ask an actual person to make sure that.
You are absolutely correct. Oftentimes we'll have many students apply for our services that, or parents that for whatever reason had never heard of waiver or don't know what it is or why they need it. So again, that's why having a VR counselor can be helpful too. We can help you with the application process for waiver, help explain why it's important to have that as you go on as well. Yep. No, really good question though, because there are a lot of misconceptions about that. Yep. Don? Don.
Yeah, so for your student who's 19, did you know about voc rehab before that? As you think about it, I know that's a quick question to ask. Is there an opportunity for that you think back that could have been utilized? And I guess what school district are you into?
They're pretty man near Iowa City, it's in Tiffin. Yeah, I actually just filled out the TPI form. What is that? Transition planning form that I wasn't given until 2021, so my son was in 18. So that's kind of filling out, what are your post-secondary expectations?
Mm-hmm.
My only expectation was that he would be able to go to school through age 21.
Okay.
That's all I knew, and I was grateful for that.
Mhm.
So I just redid that same form, now that I know about voc rehab services, and said, no, I want this for him, and this, and this, and this.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I had to do that to document sort of my ignorance
Yeah.
and the lack of education that the school had given me.
Yeah.
So I hope that is helpful, that they can see what a change there is in my understanding of what he's eligible for.
Yes. And it is hard because I think, and oftentimes, sometimes schools don't know what they don't know. And I don't know if it's oftentimes a case of maybe we're assuming someone else told you about the service. And, you know, so we never know. But I think as we continue to try to build better relationships with our high schools, hopefully that's not going to happen. And again, as we get more comfortable with the AEA, they understand our services more.